Okay, so this is part 3, actually part 4 of my series on forgotten, misrepresented, and marginalized figures. And I went to a seminar in which we discussed each of these things, and I've changed some of the stuff that the professor there taught. And the first one, does anyone remember what the first one was that we talked about? It was John the Baptist. Yeah. And I tried to make the argument that John the Baptist wasn't just someone who preceded Jesus, but was actually his mentor. And Jesus only rose to authority and power when John the Baptist is killed. Second one, Mary Magdalene, someone who's very prominent in each of the Gospels in the crucifixion scene and at the resurrection, but then disappears completely in Paul. Paul discussed everybody Jesus appears to, and the only person Jesus appears to in each of the Gospels is Mary Magdalene, and Paul either was ignorant of it or intentionally removed her from the list. And she ends up becoming associated with Gnostic Christianity, and traditional Christianity ends up rejecting her as a result, and starting to talk about her as a prostitute, which is nowhere in the Bible. It starts in around the year 600. The Pope says that she was a prostitute, and that stayed up until just a few years ago when the current Pope said, no, the previous Pope said she wasn't a prostitute. And so today we're talking about James the Just. James the Just is, we'll talk about it in a bit. We'll start with who was in charge of the Jesus moment after the crucifixion. I call it the Jesus moment because the name Christianity isn't picked up and used early on. In the book of Acts, there are 3 names for the people who belong to the movement. Christians is one, but it's not one used widely. Anybody know the other ones?
The Way.
The Way. And then some people call them the Nazarites because they're following Jesus of Nazareth. And that's in late Acts. So those are the names then. They all thought of themselves, you name any early Christian, Paul, Peter, Matthew, any of them, they didn't say we're Christians, they said we're Jewish. They thought they had the right form of Judaism. But who becomes the leader when Jesus dies? And if you go to the Vatican, and you walk up the steps to the Vatican, there are 2 huge structures. And on your left is Peter, and on your right is Paul. And if you read the book of Acts, you would come to believe that there are 2 leaders of the movement, and that's these 2 who have their feast day in June. But the question I'm going to ask you today is, how about Jesus' brother James? James the Just is his name. But before we get going, I'm going to ask you guys to help me know what you know about Jesus and his family. Do you know the names of Jesus' brothers and sisters? Does anybody have any idea?
Judas.
Judas is right. Author, supposedly, not really, but supposedly of the book of Jude. The book of Jude's in the Bible because people believed it was written by him. Also, the Gospel of Thomas is Judas Thomas is the author of the Gospel of Thomas, the Gnostic Gospel, and it's Jesus talking to him and relaying sayings. So Jude or Judas is right. Any other guesses?
There are several mentions of brothers and sisters without names.
Well, actually, let's go through these things. Instead of putting a bunch of verses up on here,
Yeah, that'd be great.
we're going to read the verses. And on several occasions, they're named.
Thanks. Sometimes not.
Yeah, sometimes not. And we'll start with the first one. I did 30. If you need, if that's not enough, loan them to someone else, and share them with a spouse or someone you think that you like a whole lot, or somebody you're dating, or somebody you're not dating. You can use this as an opportunity to get to know somebody. So we'll start with Mark 3. Which gospel is written first? I told you to ask you this question repeatedly. The gospel, which gospel of the 4 gospels is written first? Mark is right. And this is the first reference in Mark to any of the family members. Then Jesus went home, and at home here is Capernaum. And the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, that's Jesus' family heard this, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, he has gone out of his mind. Jesus is crazy. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he has Beelzebub, and by the ruler of demons, he casts out demons. This is a variant, what I was just talking about. The way this, I think, is actually, this is actually, it's not the word people, it actually says, for they were saying. And I think that they is the family. I think in this, the most logical way to read this is Jesus' family thought something was going on, so they leave Nazareth and go to Capernaum and try to bring him home, because they think something has seriously gone wrong with him. Okay? Mark 6. This is the first time we ever get any names associated with who Jesus is. He left the place and he came to his hometown, so he goes to Nazareth. And it's interesting, in Mark, he tries to do miracles, and he can't because the people don't believe him. And in Luke changes that. He has that text and he changes it, and he just makes it, Jesus is unable to perform any miracles. We don't know why, but he can't. And he ends up leaving. His own people rejecting. But here it goes. What is this wisdom that that's been given him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is it not this? Is this not the carpenter? Again, this moves all around. In Mark, it's his father who's a carpenter, and the term's not actually carpenter. It's like a low-level woodworker, or some people say it's like someone who just works at a construction site. Technon is the Greek word. The son of Mary, which is what's interesting about that. In the first century, you never said the son of the mother, you always said the son of the father. So where's Joseph here? And the brothers of James, Joseph. Joseph is a shorter, well, first of all, James, you don't hear the name James very much in the Old Testament. That's because James is the Greek version of Jacob. So Jacob is an incredibly popular name in this area. Joseph is Joseph, and it's like a nickname version. It's like Joey, okay? And Judas, as you said, and Simon, and not his sisters here with us. And they took offense at him. So we have how many siblings? We have at least
4.
At least 6. You have 4 guys and at least 2 sisters. And tradition tells us the names of the sisters were Salome and Mary. And there are lots of Marys in this story, and they're going to get confusing, and I'm going to make them even more confusing right now. So what's the relationship between Jesus and his siblings? These are 3 different views. There are more than this, but these are the 3 traditional views that we have right now. And this is the one that Protestants have, and of course, it looks complex, but it's not really. It has Mary and Joseph. They had 6 children, and Jude's grandson ends up becomes the bishop of Jerusalem. And over here, Clopas is the brother of Joseph, and Simeon, supposedly a cousin of James, becomes the leader of Jerusalem. And the thing is, a lot of people think it's this guy and this guy are the same person. So it's actually Jesus' brother. First brother, then the second brother that runs the church after his death. And there's a book that's pretty popular right now, arguing that it was a dynasty. It starts with Jesus, and it was family members for the first 10 generations of leading the church. So this is the Protestant view. And I say brothers and sisters are half brothers and half sisters, because if you believe that Mary was a virgin when she had Jesus, then they didn't share a father, and so that they would all be half brothers, half sisters. But if you're, and there's one group I'm going to mention, if you are an Evianite, you believe Mary and Joseph were the parents of all 7 of them. Okay, so that's the first and original idea about it. And then this idea emerges, 2 ideas actually. It starts becoming popular in the 2nd and then 3rd century, especially, that Mary was a virgin. And she was a virgin her entire life, called perpetual virginity. You've heard that idea. And then the Immaculate Conception. Do you know what the Immaculate Conception is?
Being raised Catholic, I know.
And what is it? Everybody gets this wrong. First of all, I first as a Protestant in West Virginia with no Catholics around me, all I knew about was the Immaculate Reception. And I was like, that's funny, but what's that mean? Because it's not talking about Jesus' birth, it's talking about whose birth?
Well, Mary herself was conceived without sin, or
Catholics believe.
yeah, Catholics believe.
Actually, we'll talk about Catholics in just a second. This is not the Catholic perspective I'm talking about. This next one. This is not the Catholic perspective. This is the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox belief.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
And they believe Mary had Jesus, and that was a virgin, and that all the other kids were from Joseph, who had an earlier family. Okay, if you go to Eastern Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox, this is what they'll teach you. Okay, and this is the second idea that emerges because people started having difficulty with this idea of if Mary, and again, for the first 2 centuries of the church, it just wasn't a thing. But then when it starts emerging, especially beginning in the eastern part of the church, they come up with this idea that they are stepbrother and stepsisters. Okay, and that's still prominent. But then in the 4th century, Jerome, who does a lot of great things and also does a lot of meddling, decides that this is not right. And he, knowing the idea of the perpetual virginity and the Immaculate Conception, comes up with the idea that both Joseph and Mary were conceived without sin. Sin started to become associated with sex at this time, like one of the worst things that ever happened in the church. An original sin with Augustine, and it moves on and on. But as this idea starts to pick up steam, he came up with this idea that Mary and Joseph were born without sex, and that God was the father of both, and as a result, Jesus was born without sin. And that Mary, this is what gets really weird, and is only recently Catholics have been trying to fix this because it's weird, that Mary had a sister named Mary, sort of like George Foreman. What were his kids' names?
George.
So Mary had a sister named Mary who was married to Clopas, and then had these children, and so they are the cousins of Jesus. Were you taught that they were cousins in the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
In fact, you can find Bibles now, and the words Adelphos means brothers, about the brothers. There's a word for cousins, but you can find, like the Jerusalem Bible, which is a Catholic Bible, says cousins throughout. James is the cousin. But as Protestants today, we generally hold to this version. Now this one's been changed somewhat because it's weird to have a family with Mary and Mary, and then this one has another daughter named Mary, so you start getting confused. So modern Catholic scholars started arguing that Joseph had a brother named Clopas, and Clopas was married to another Mary who was not related to this Mary, and then they come with that, and you got to figure out the whole thing. So that's where everyone stands. So let's keep on reading on what the Bible says. There are at least 4 passages in the Gospels, and a couple of them appear in both Matthew and Mark. So I'm taking Matthew, and this is a scene where Jesus is talking to a crowd, and they say, hey, your mother, and this is Matthew 12, your mother and brothers are standing outside waiting to see you. And he replies, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And he says, the people who follow me and are preparing for the kingdom of God are my actual brothers. So you read these things and you start wondering, where do family values go? Because he's, none of these people, he's very highly critical of them. And then Luke tells the same story, tells the story from Mark 6, and drops all the names of everybody. To him, he just doesn't care who the siblings are. It's not important to him. And then finally, we go to John, and Jesus is in Galilee, and there's a festival going on. And his brother said, leave here and go to Judea, so that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one who wants to be widely known acts in secret. So basically, go there and show off your stuff. Because in Mark, he does his healings and other things, and then he tells people, don't tell anybody about this stuff. In John, he does them as signs so that people would see it and then say, hey, this is the Son of God. And then it has this line in there, parenthetically, for not even his brothers believed in him at this point. So at this point we have, if all you knew about James was from the Gospels, this is what you get. You get defined as minor, it's opposed to his ministry, and there seems to be some sort of effort to diminish what they're doing. Because if you were writing a biography, a regular biography about a character, you would tell all about the family, right? So that's the situation you get in. And then you turn to the book of Acts. And there are in the Bible two scenes on the James and the other brothers. They're two whiplash moments. And if this is all you read and you get to Acts, then you're going to have a whiplash moment. Doesn't happen first. In Acts 1, there's the scene of Pentecost, and everybody's gathering together, and the disciples are getting together, and they're trying to figure out who is going to replace Judas, because they were called the 12, but at this point Judas is dead, and they had to pick another person. And it turns out, without any explanation, all these were constantly devoting themselves to prayer together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. So wait a second, the brothers are not outside of what's going on with Jesus, they're insiders. So how did this happen? Okay, some people, and then this continues in Acts 12. Peter has a situation where he's put in jail, and he gets out of jail, and this is what he says. Peter mentioned to them with his hands to be silent and describe for them how the Lord had brought him out of prison. And he added, tell this to James and to the believers. Then he left and went to another place. So you might know Luke and Acts are the same book. Same author. He's just telling two parts of the story. Part one and then the sequence. Just like any good movie that you have today. So in the part one, he doesn't mention James at all. Doesn't even in any of these scenes doesn't mention him, and doesn't mention anything about him until you get to Acts 12, and then he drops his name, and he just sort of assumes you know who he is. But if you've been reading through the Bible, you have no idea who James is, except for that way back when he thought he was crazy. So how did this happen? So some people believe the story of the brothers were suppressed, and I'm going to give you an author who thinks that actually the brothers of Jesus were actually disciples and apostles of Jesus, and that their names have been changed slightly. I don't buy this, but it's an interesting concept. So if you had to name the 12 disciples, who would you come up with? The easiest ones are Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They're the ones who are there, and this is from Acts 1. If you're coming up with a list of names, here are the disciples, okay? The other ones, the next four you might remember would be Matthew, Thomas, Philip, and Bartholomew. All of them have stories in the New Testament about them, all 8 of these. And of course, the 9th guy has stories about him too, Judas Iscariot. So we know these 9, but then there are 3 that are weird, and their only appearance of their names have to do with the list of disciples and no stories about them whatsoever. The name is James, the son of Alphaeus, Judas, and Simon. And what did we say the names of Jesus' brothers were? We said James, Judas, Simon, and Joseph. Joey's the name. So this guy, James Tabor, wrote a book called The Jesus Dynasty, and he says, actually, the authors of these books are trying to keep you from knowing how integral Jesus' family was. As I told you, I don't really buy it, but it's really, really interesting to think about this sort of stuff. So let's go to Acts 15. And this is the second whiplash moment that you get in this story. And this one's the long one, and I'll try to read through it quickly. Then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So the weird thing is about Christianity, it starts out as a Jewish movement. And there's this huge debate. And you know, the church still today has these debates about borders. If you go to a Catholic church, they're explicit. You're on the outside and you can't take communion unless you're Catholic. And in Protestant churches, there are 200 denominations, and you know, they're the insiders and the outsiders. And they have this big issue of who's an insider and who's an outsider at this point. And the question is, do we go to the Gentiles and try to convert them? And some people said no. Some people said yes, but you've got to circumcise them. And then you had people like Paul, who said yes, but no circumcision. So they're trying to figure this all out. And then and so Paul and Barnabas, who are in the middle of this ministry, they go and they meet with the elders and the brothers of Jesus in Acts 15 here to discuss the question, it's in bold, with the apostles and the elders. So they were sent on their way by the church, and as they passed through Phoenicia and Samaria, they reported the conversion of Gentiles. So they're still converting Gentiles all along while they're doing this. And they were welcomed by the church. But some believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees stood up and said, it is necessary for them to be circumcised in order to keep the law of Moses. The interesting thing about it is we were all taught that the Pharisees were horrible people, but you'll find again and again that some of the first people to follow Jesus were Pharisees. And that's what these are. These are Pharisees who followed Jesus and were believers, but they believed if you were a Gentile, you got to be circumcised. Now, if you're a Gentile and you're converted, there's a name for the people who were Gentiles who were not fully Jewish at this time. They're called the God-fearers. Okay? And that's who he's hitting up. He's going to the synagogues, and there was this group of people who would hang out there and say, this is really interesting, I want to listen to this, but they weren't Jewish. So they weren't accepted fully, and they were going in and saying, have you heard about Jesus? Blah, 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 blah. So you had this group saying they had to be circumcised. Now, there's a group that didn't want this group to be circumcised, and that is the people, the Gentiles who were converted. They were like, yeah, the last thing in the world we want to do is to get circumcised. So there's a huge debate. I mean, it's a serious debate. Do you circumcise them or not? And so that's what Paul does. He says, I've got to get an answer to this question. So I'm going to Jerusalem, and I'm going to meet with the apostles and elders. And then you see in the second paragraph, Peter gets up and gives his take on the whole situation. And then in the third paragraph, Barnabas and Paul get up and give their take on the whole situation. And then in the bold in the last paragraph, it says, after everybody else had spoken, James replied, my brothers, listen to me. And then pick up on the next page, the very last paragraph. And here's like the boom moment. If all you've read are the Gospels and you read through Acts now, and you get to this moment, you get James stand up and say, I have therefore reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, meaning we don't have to circumcise them, but we should write to them to abstain only from those things polluted by idols, which is part of the Torah, and from sexual immorality, and for whatever has been strangled and is from blood. For in every city for generations past, Moses has had those who proclaim him. So who makes a decision what's going to happen here? It's James. It's not Peter. It's not John. It's not Paul. James is the one who says, this is what's going to happen from now on. And anytime you reach a Gentile, I'm going to give you this letter, and you can tell them, this is what I've decided. Okay? Isn't this crazy? We've never been told. James is actually, for like, as I said, if you go to the Christian church, if you go back to the year AD 40 or AD 50, Paul was a minor figure. Peter was a secondary figure. James was the guy in charge. So we keep on going, and actually, I typed out all these out of memory, and then I was driving the other day, and I thought, yeah, I forgot two. So we'll do two other sections that mention the James in 1 Corinthians, and this is again by Paul writing about the apostles. And people are questioning. He's frequently working as a tent maker, and he's saying, why don't the people I'm preaching to pay me so I don't have to do these things? And he says other people are doing that. And he says, well, look at the apostles. Do they have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife, as do the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Who is Cephas? Does anybody know? Peter. That's the Aramaic version of Peter. So he's saying, interesting, the apostles are going around trying to convert people, primarily in Jerusalem, and they're taking their families with them, and they're being paid. So Paul is basically saying, where's the moolah for me? I don't think I should be making these tents. It's a lot of hard work. And why can't I get that? And then this one, which is one that's bothered me for a long, long time. It's Paul talking about who Jesus appeared to. And he appeared to Cephas first, and then the 12, which is actually 11 at that point. And then he appeared to more than 500. This is the scene of Pentecost. Then he appeared to James and then to all the apostles. And at this time, the idea of apostle is a bigger group than the 12. 12 were there. Then they meet with James. And then he says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. Look how humble he is. He's talking about these other guys for I'm the least of all the apostles. I'm the last. So it looks like with this Corinthians, he's saying, trust them, believe them, they're the authorities, and I'm here, and I've listened to all his stories, trust me too, but they're really important. But that's not what happens in the book of Galatians. One of my favorite books in the Bible. And that's where we get to Galatians 1. And I wrote on here, because we're generally taught in the book of Acts, and we're taught in Sunday school, and we're taught all over the place that the Christian church started out as the apostles. They all agree with each other like the trunk of a tree, and the church grows up through it. And then there are branches that are heresies, and we have to cut them off from time to time. But the church today, and you get taught this in the Catholic Church especially, and you get taught it in the Protestant church up until recently. And there was a guy named Walter Bauer who sort of changed the narrative in the 1930s, and his work wasn't translated until the 70s, and it's just now working its way through the church. That he argued the metaphor should be like multiple streams. There are lots of versions of how people understood Jesus and what he should be, and those in the 3rd century were all brought together and made to say this is what the Orthodox Church is. But the early church was highly divided. And how do we know that? Because it's in the Bible. And I'm going to give you this section in Galatians, which is just awesome. So Paul is writing, and he converts. I don't think it's really a conversion, because he thinks he's still Jewish, but he has a change of mind about who Jesus is. Okay? And then after 3 years, he's trying to figure out what he believes and what he thinks. And after 3 years, he's out in the wilderness near anybody who's been to Israel has probably been to Petra. So he goes to Petra and hangs out there for 3 years. So if you're in Petra sometimes and they're telling you all about the people, the Nubians and stuff, you should remember, this is where when it says he went out into the wilderness, this is where he went. So he went there for 3 years to figure out himself and to pray and do all those things. And then he says, well, maybe I should go check with the leaders of the church. So he first meets with Peter, and then he meets with James, the Lord's brother. That's it. Okay? He thinks, if I need to get in touch with them, these two are the two key guys in the church at this point. And then he went back to Syria, and then he starts preaching everywhere. And then Galatians 2. So he's doing this stuff for 14 years, and this issue about the Gentiles and whether they should be circumcised or anything else starts to become an issue. And so he goes there, and this is, many people believe, and I think it's probably true, his version of that Jerusalem council where James took over and said, these are the rules. This is his first-hand account of what happened there. He says he went into a private meeting with the acknowledged leaders. And I think a better translation of this is the so-called leaders. He's like, I'm the guy, I know what I'm doing. I'm going to talk to them, and I'm going to talk to the so-called leaders. And he names the so-called leaders. He says it is James, and later on he'll say, those who are supposed to be the acknowledged leaders, again, the so-called leaders, what they are makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. So it doesn't matter to me that they're the pillars of the church. I don't care. I'm as important as they are. Okay? Very different from 1 Corinthians, where he's saying, I'm humble, I'm the last of them. Now he's saying, God shows no partiality. I am just as important as they are. And then they say there's a decision. There's the gospel to the circumcised, which is people who are Jewish, and the gospel for the uncircumcised. Okay, so he's saying there are two different ministries going on, and he's the leader of the gospel for the uncircumcised, and Peter is the head of the gospel for the circumcised. And they said, James and Cephas and John, who were the acknowledged pillars, again, the so-called pillars, recognize the grace that's been given to me, and they told me, okay, keep on doing what you're doing. And then this is the amazing section, because you don't get to see this in other parts of the Bible. And I'll read the whole thing. But when Cephas came to Antioch, which is where Paul was, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. Now, Jews are supposed to keep kosher and eat with other Jews. Okay? And there are these Gentiles who've been converted, and Peter says, okay, I'll eat with them. So he's eating with them, and then James sends a group of people there to see what's going on, and they see Peter there, and Peter says, whoa, okay, I shouldn't be doing this, and then he switches over. And what does Paul say about this? He ends up saying that he's a hypocrite. that Peter is a hypocrite. He used to eat with the Gentiles, but after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction, that's James, and the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy. So that even Barnabas was led astray, so his partner leaves too, with the truth of the gospel. I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? So you get this whole scene. The funny thing is, if you're not there, what do you think the people in the Jerusalem church heard about this whole incident? They're probably hearing that Paul is crazy and he's doing all this stuff and it's not according to the Bible. So we turn to the last, did I put Galatians? Forgot to put Acts. Oh, Acts 21. Let's go back to Acts 21. So we have all this background now. There's this thing in the Gospels, he's diminished and unimportant. In Acts, he moves sort of to the center and is important, but still not as important as Peter and Paul. And then you have a direct confrontation between James and Peter and James. And who is right? From Paul's perspective, he thinks he's right. What would James say? So, I mean, you have this open conflict in the early church, which nobody reads Galatians today, but that's a great story, isn't it? I mean, it's just amazing that you have someone rebuking Peter and calling James a hypocrite. So in Acts 21, after all this stuff has happened, Paul decides to go visit James again, okay? And James says that people are saying about you that you're not keeping the law. And he says, really? Okay. And then James tells him, we have 4 men. This is in bold, the third bolded section. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Join these men, go through the rite of purification with them, and pay for the shaving of our heads. Thus all of you know that there's nothing in what we have been told about you, but what you yourself observe and guard the law. So if you do this, we'll all know you're okay. So do these things. And then finally, they do this, shave their heads, he pays, he does all this stuff. Then Paul took them in, and the next day, having purified himself, he entered the temple with them, making public the completion of the days of purification when the sacrifice would be made for each of them. And what happens? They get arrested. The Jewish people get really mad that they're there, and the authorities come and arrest him, take him to Caesarea Maritima, eventually to Rome, where he's executed. The interesting thing, the Acts doesn't tell us about this sort of stuff. Where was James when he gets arrested? James is a very prominent figure at this point. Why didn't they intervene? And even more, and a question that you might ask yourself is, did James set him up? Did he know this was going to happen? So you have this really interesting dynamic between the two of them. He's calling James a hypocrite. James says, what you need to do in the middle of Passover is to go up on the temple and declare to everybody that you're keeping the rules and you're doing fine, and it blows up on him. So there's the story that we have there, but that's not all we get on James. We get stories outside the Bible. And the thing is, outside the Bible, there's a ton of stuff on James.
You ripped off your mic.
Okay. And there's a big emphasis in particular on his martyrdom. I'm going to tell you about this guy named Josephus. He's an early church father, 2nd century, right in about the year 130. So probably 70 years after the death of James. James is killed, it appears in the year 62. So he's killed like 2 years before Paul is. But right before, what happens in the year 66? Does anybody know? I've told you again and again, but it's hard to remember.
Destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans.
And the most important story to know to understand why the Gospels are written, and the New Testament is written the way it is because of the Jerusalem revolt, where up to 1 million Jews are killed by the Romans. And the Jewish church flees to a place called Pella, and then they eventually come back. But at that point, the Jewish Christians want to make clear they're not part of the group of Jews who started the revolt. So there's this fighting that starts going on that carries through all of the texts of the New Testament. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I'm a little confused between the dispute between James and Peter and Paul. I know Paul is all for allowing the Gentiles as Christians without circumcision. And Peter, I know, comes around to that, I believe, in Acts. And what is James' position on this?
It's not particularly clear. And that is, I think there are, I'm going to try to complicate it to make it simpler. We have the two groups, the gospel of the circumcised, which is led by James, and then the gospel of the uncircumcised, which is led by Paul. There are, as I can tell, three factions in both of these. There's the group that says in the gospel of the circumcised, they say Jews are the only people who can follow Jesus. We should have no ministry at all to Jesus at all. To Gentiles at all, just us. Then there's the group that says we can try to convert Gentiles, but they've got to be circumcised. And then you have the third group, which appears in Acts 15. We can have a ministry to the Jews, but we can have it to the Gentiles, but they have certain rules that they're going to have to follow. So there's some rules, but not the entire Torah. Those are the three groups there. James fits in somewhere between 2 and 3. The Pharisees fit in at 2, and a group called the Evianites fit in at 1. So these people have different ideas about who they let in and why they let them in. On the gospel of the uncircumcised, group 4 is very similar to group 3. They convert, they believe that there could be two ministries, one to the Gentiles and one to the Jews, and the Jews have to follow certain rules from the Torah. Then there's a group that says there are two ministries, you can preach to both, but the Gentiles don't have to follow the law at all. Okay, and the Jews have to, but they don't have to. And then there's a group, the sixth group, which are called the antinomian people. They believe the law is dead and no one has to follow the law at all. Okay, and that's what in Acts 21, the group that arrests him accuses Paul of being in group 6. They said, you're throwing out the law for everybody. You are radical and you're destroying things. So they arrest him for that reason. He would argue he was in group 5 or 4, probably 5. James fits in probably with 2 or 3 on that side. Do you get it? Does that help at all?
It does.
So you essentially have all these factions where they're trying to fit it all together, and eventually, in the end, group 6 wins out. That's what we have today. Nobody here follows the law. I mean, do we? We're meeting on Sunday, not Saturday. We end up throwing out everything. Paul wins. And that's what part of this story is. The story is the Bible is written by the winners in many cases, and Paul and Peter are the winners. James is a loser, and that's why he disappears from the text.
And that's why no women are even discussed.
There are some, actually.
Well, no, but I mean in this issue.
Romans 16 is probably the best list of women involved in the early Christian movement. And it includes an apostle by the name of Julia.
Yeah, I know that.
But, I mean, so you're right, it is mainly guys. I mean, and it's not just the New Testament, it's the Old Testament too.
Oh, yeah.
And, when you look at Jesus' genealogy, you'll see a few women mentioned in there, but not many. But the funny thing is, all of the women are not Jews in there.
That's right.
Yeah, like Rahab and others like that, and Ruth.
So some evangelical
I have to go pay bills.
Protestants, they sound like they might be more, in one of the earlier groups when they take serious the stuff in Leviticus, etc.
The who did?
Some of the
Protestants, you were saying?
Yeah, like
Luke hated James.
Missouri Synod, for instance.
He hated James. Luke did, because James taught that salvation came through faith and works. The epistle to James says, faith without works is dead. What does Luther say? It's all about faith, and it's not about works. You can't work your way into getting into heaven. And that's part of the reason there was such a hard time getting the epistle of James into the Bible. Plus the fact that no one ever mentioned it until the around 80. But if he had a chance to, Luther would have taken James out because he said it confused people and everything. And I think actually it wasn't written by James, but one of his followers. And I think it's written specifically to oppose Paul. It's another situation where if you read Romans and you read James next to each other, you would say neither of these people are in the same group. There's two different perspectives on early Christianity. So outside of the Bible, everybody knew who James was. And that's why when you read Acts, the author of Acts assumes everybody knows about him. So I don't have to tell you who James is. And you have this guy, Josephus, who lives just a few years after James did. He tells us that James took over the church at Jesus' death. He was called the Just for his close adherence to the Jewish law. And he was called the bulwark of the people. He didn't drink wine, eat meat, shave hair, or bathe. Sounds like a great guy to hang around with. Was alone and being allowed in the holy place, the Holy of Holies, where he prayed often for forgiveness of Jewish people. And he prayed so much that his knees became hard as camels. And then that Passover comes, and the Jewish community is splitting up in a lot of different ways. And so the Pharisees asked him, would you get up here on the highest point of the temple and tell everybody you knew who Jesus was, and he's not the Son of God, and he's not the Messiah? Just tell everybody this, okay? This is what we're talking about. This is the highest part. If you've been to Jerusalem, this is the Temple Mount. It's this corner. People come up to the temple through these stairs. There's the pool right here. You cleanse yourself, and then you go up into there. And then you stand up there and tell this stuff. Well, he sort of blew it. He got up there. He doesn't say he's the Son of God, but he does say he's the Messiah, and that everybody should believe in him. And the result is, the scribes and Pharisees, went up and threw down the just man and said to each other, let us stone James the just. And they began to stone him, for he was not killed by the fall, but he knelt down and began and said, I entreat thee, Lord of God, our Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And one of them, who was a fuller, took a club with which he had beaten out his clothes and struck the just man on the head and killed him. Okay, this is one version. And then Josephus says that the revolt in Jerusalem that leads to the death of about 1 million Jews was a response to this. Because the most just man who lived in Jerusalem was killed, God brought down punishment on the people. Okay? Then there's a second story, which is by Flavius Josephus. It's different, but the funny thing is everybody knows about his death. This is something that people read about, and Flavius Josephus is not even a Christian. Okay? And at that time, there was a break in leadership. The guy who was in charge of Jerusalem died, and the guy who was appointed was living in Egypt. And so Ananias, who was the high priest at the time, like Caiaphas was earlier, and he says, this younger Ananias, who, as we have told you already, took the high priest's head, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, very rigid in judging other people. He was very, very critical of poor people and poor priests, saying that the rich Sadducees were keeping all the money for themselves and not helping the poor people. And so when Ananias had a chance, he thought he had a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was dead, and Albinus was coming from Egypt. He's gone, so there's this gap. And so Ananias assembled the Sanhedrin and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who's called Christ. Remember, this is by a Jewish guy who is not a Christian, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when they had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So in both cases, he gets stoned. The other one, he gets hit in the head with a club and dies that way. And those are not just the only ones that make reference to Jesus. There are Gnostic Gospels, there are other texts. Here are just a few of them. The Gospel of Thomas, which we've made reference to. Listen to this. If all you knew was what's in the New Testament and you ran into the Gospel of Thomas, you would be completely baffled. The disciples said to Jesus, we know that you will depart from us. Who is it to be our leader? And Jesus said to them, wherever you are to go to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. And then Clement of Alexander, early church father, late 1st century, and he says, for they said that Peter, James, and John, the original disciples, the three guys who were there at the Transfiguration, after the ascension of our Savior, as if also preferred by our Lord, strove not after honor, but chose James and James the Just, Bishop of Jerusalem. So they all said, not us, James is the guy, we're going to name him. And then later, the next one, Clement says later, the Lord, after his resurrection, imparted knowledge to James the Just and Peter and John, and then they passed on this secret knowledge to the people, which sounds like the Gnostic stuff. And there are there are 4 books that were found in Nag Hammadi in 1945 that have a discussion of who James is and his importance. And then there are 2 more from the Syriac recognitions. And this one has Jesus himself appointed James as to the head of things. The church in Jerusalem that was established by our Lord was increasing in numbers, being ruled uprightly and firmly by James, who was made overseer over it by our Lord. And wherefore observe the greatest caution, that you believe no teacher unless he bring from Jerusalem the testimony of James, the brother of Jesus, or of whosoever may come after him. So the question is, if everybody knew all this stuff about James, why is he not given, I think, proper recognition in the New Testament, or in the early church, or today? Because none of you knew this stuff, right? And it's crazy, some of the stuff that's in there. They're fighting with each other. They're trying to figure out things. So what happened? Why is it that he doesn't get the attention that he deserves? Does anybody have any ideas? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with what books we chose, and in particular, Luke and Acts. Luke and Acts elevate 2 people, first Peter and then Paul, and he has to mention James because everybody knows James, and that's the only reason he mentions him. So Luke and Acts is largely responsible for the standard portrait of early Christianity, in which Paul and Peter are dominant and James is secondary. Mary, the mother of Jesus, fades after Acts 1:14. I showed you that verse earlier in 1:14 where it said Mary and the brothers were together with the people of Pentecost. That's the last reference we ever hear of her again. And I want you to think about this too. You know, another thing that happens in addition to Luke and Acts is the idea of Mary's virginity takes off in the 3rd and 4th century. And it's hard to elevate James when the church believes that Mary was a virgin when she gave birth. So James is no longer the brother of Jesus, but he's either the stepbrother or the cousin, and he ends up getting diminished as a result of this. So Mary ends up fading from the Bible. Mary Magdalene's never mentioned in Acts on the founding of the church. John the Baptist is presented as minor and superseded, and Peter begins to fade in Acts 10 and 11, and then Paul takes over. And what do you get from James? You get James saying, oh God, you guys are all right, just keep on doing what you're doing, which isn't what they're saying in Galatians. So, I mean, that's some of the reasons they disappear. But do they disappear altogether? Okay? What happens to this movement that Jesus starts? And I told you, with what happened at the Jerusalem revolt, they flee, the whole group does, and goes to a Gentile area and stay there. And then they come back after the thing is done, and they hang out there until 135 when there's another Jewish revolt, and the Romans throw all Jews out of there. And Gentiles take over completely at that point. But there are groups of Jewish Christians that continue. And the largest one is a group called the Evianites. Has anyone ever heard of the Evianites? So when my son Zach was in high school, everybody was supposed to set up a Facebook page and say what their religion was. And they were all told to say, he went to Marquette High, so they were all told to be Catholic. And he told his teacher, I'm not Catholic. And he told me it's Lutheran, and the teacher's like, why are you here? And I was like, yeah, that's another story. And he said, Dad, is there some group that I could put on there that would really forget my religion? So I said, say you're an Evianite. So for a year, and at the end of the course, he didn't say anything to his religion professor. He was a religion teacher. And he said, who the heck are the Evianites? And so I opened him up and Zach was like, who are they? I said, okay, here's who they are. They believed in one God and considered Jesus his prophet and Messiah, but did not consider Jesus divine. And that's key to this. This is Messiah means that you're going to be the leader of the earth and you're going to judge things on God's behalf. But it doesn't mean you're the Son of God. Those are 2 different titles. When you hear Jesus Christ, that's Jesus the Messiah. You can be Jesus Christ without being a divine figure. Okay, it's John that ends up saying those are all together. But you'll read in Mark all about Jesus Christ being a Messiah, but you don't find very much about him being divine. It's not in there. Okay, and the Evianites continued this going on. They rejected the virgin birth of Jesus, like I told you at the very beginning when I said we'll get back around to it. So here we are with 5 minutes to go. We get back to that. They reject the birth of Jesus, holding that he was the natural born son of Mary and Joseph. They favored the Gospel of Matthew minus the birth narrative. So it's funny, with each of these sects that were around, many of the Gnostics liked John and disliked the other Gospels, and they liked Paul. The Evianites, by contrast, loved Matthew, because in Matthew, you're told to follow the law. Jesus says, I'm not changing the jot or tittle in the law. And in fact, he says in Matthew 23 that you should be as pure and following the law as the Pharisees. That's what he tells his disciples. So it's very solid and structured around that. And in Matthew 25, there's the story of the sheep and the goats. And how do you get to the kingdom of God? It's not based on what you believe. It's based on whether you help the poor, go to the inmates, and do all of those things. It's about works, not faith. And so the early Evianites really, really liked this book. But they really hated Paul, so they threw out everything that Paul was associated with him. They called him the something disciple, but essentially meaning he was an evil guy. Don't read any of his stuff. They held that Jesus was adopted at his baptism by God as his son because Jesus followed the Jewish law scrupulously. And this is called adoptionism, and there were several other groups that were adoptionists, but this is the most prominent one. And then they kept the law faithfully, believing they were to help the poor, sick, and the needy, including widows and orphans, which the epistle of James explicitly tells everybody to do. This is something that you don't hear in Paul. They were vegetarians because they believed animal sacrifices ended. Most people eating meat ate the meat after a sacrifice. And if there are no more sacrifices, Jesus was the final sacrifice, you weren't supposed to eat meat. So like 5 years ago, PETA started this campaign saying we're not the first vegetarians. There was this group in the 2nd century, and I was like, yes, people want to know who the Evianites are. And then it disappeared. But they did have these signs saying we weren't the first vegetarians. And then finally, they practiced holy poverty. They thought, like the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you gave all your money to the group and you had no money. And they performed ritual ablutions. They frequently were bathing themselves to make themselves pure. So this group goes on, but it slowly diminishes and disappears because the Gentile version ends up taking over. So that's generally what I have to say. Some of you might remember James for an incident about 20 years ago. It's when they found this ossuary. And it said, an ossuary is a bone box. And because during this period between like 100 BC and AD 100, the Jews believed in resurrection. They don't believe in resurrection now, but they did at that time. And so what they would do is someone would die, and after a year, they would go in and collect your bones, put them in a box. So when you're resurrected, and you're resurrected with the bones you died with, they would take that with them. So they would take scrupulous care of this stuff. And so there are tons of ossuaries all over Jerusalem. If you see the graveyards and stuff, you'll see tons of ossuaries. But one guy said he had found an ossuary that said, James, the son of Joseph, and brother of Jesus. So it created an incredible sensation in 2002. The picture on the left are some of these, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy. And again, the person who said about women, not many women up there. These are all the top religious scholars in America looking at the thing. And you'll see when they shipped it from Israel to Toronto, which is where this is, they dropped it and there's a huge thing in there. And this is the guy who said he found it up in the upper right, and that's where it says what it says on the bone box. I don't really buy it. I did go to Toronto and hung out with these guys and looked at the bone box, and at that time I thought, I don't know Hebrew or Aramaic. It's in Aramaic. So I didn't know if it looked valid or not. And there was an epigrapher who said it looked valid to him. And then eventually the Israeli authorities sued him. Oh, they'd go on and said that this was a forgery. He won the case. He was found not guilty. It doesn't mean that's valid or not valid. They just said he wasn't the one who forged this signature. And he probably couldn't. He's not a very intelligent guy. In fact, when they came and raided his home to get this thing, it was on the top of the back of his toilet seat. So he said he had it for 20 or 30 years, but he didn't know Jesus had a brother, just like many Christians do. He knew about the Catholic version. He knew he had cousins, but he had no idea he had a brother, so he thought it was someone else. And then someone saw it and said, hey, this could be worth something. So right now, it's in Jerusalem. It's held by the Israeli authorities. It's not presented anywhere. There are a lot of people, there are a lot of scholars who do think it's legitimate, mainly Protestants. But I'm not among those, and I'm not a scholar either, so that doesn't really matter. But that happened. I mean, it's crazy the amount of attention, front page of the New York Times and everything like that. So I wrote the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus and the son of Joseph. I mean, it would be great if you found that. And we found actually ossuaries that do have the names of famous people. Caiaphas, the high priest during Jesus' day, we do have his whole family. They found a tomb with all of his family members in it. And they've done DNA testing and discovered, yeah, that's just his stuff. It's just, this I don't think is the thing. But regardless of all this, James was, as I said, if you go back to the year 40 or 50 AD, you would realize that James was the most important person in the Jewish Christian movement. But today, very few people know that. So, kind of over a couple minutes. Anybody, I'll take one or two questions if anybody has any. Go ahead.
Well, talk about the bones, the story in the Old Testament about the dry bones in the desert, and that God can take those bones and bring the people back. And that's probably where that belief comes from.
It comes from, that's true, but it also comes from the book of Daniel. Mm-hmm. The Jews had taught that if you followed and did what Jesus told, I mean, what the law told you, you would be rewarded. But when people started taking over Israel and they started punishing people for following the law, it created this cognitive dissonance, because it now was, if you follow the law, you might get killed, and your family might get killed. There was a guy who was pretty horrible called Antiochus Epiphanes, who went through and says he killed 50,000 Jews because they were following the law. So where is justice if not on this earth? If you are doing what the Bible tells you to do, or what the Torah tells you to do, and you get punished and get killed for it, is there any justice? So in the book of Daniel, chapter 11, he comes up with a novel idea, which is nowhere in the Old Testament before Daniel, which is the last book written in the Old Testament. And he says, yeah, there's a resurrection. Martyrs are going to be resurrected and taken to heaven. And that's in the year, around the year 165 BC, and that's the first mention we get of it in Judaism. So it's just funny where ideas come from. There was this, how do we deal with this thing? And they said, yes, there is justice. I mean, similar to the Hitler question, if there is no afterlife, is there any justice for him? And to them, they came up with this idea, yeah, there is life after death.
In terms of medieval iconography, James is very seldom seen. And I found it interesting that in St. Paul's Episcopal Church here in Milwaukee, which is famous for its Tiffany windows, there's this life-size image. And I asked Paul Halbrick, who's their stained glass guy, who that was. Was it John? And he said, that's James.
You do have this thing still going on, because he is there in the Bible, and he's very much there in the stuff after the Bible is the books of the Bible were written. There's at the National Cathedral, they have a work, it's a triptych, and they have Jesus in the middle, and you would think it's a picture of Peter on one side, and if you saw the pictures, like that very first one that I showed at the beginning, the El Greco painting, you would think that the guy on that side was Paul, but it turns out it's James. I should have brought the picture, because Peter looks really angry looking across at James. Like, what are you doing here? But it's an interesting thing, because Paul has this figure that people had. He was short, had problems, didn't look very good, was bald. So he's very recognizable. And the guy sitting across had lots of gray hair and looked a little more like that. And so people were figuring out, hey, this is James who's there. It's not there. And as I told you, if you go, if you go to the Vatican, you have Peter on the left and Paul on the right, and James is nowhere to be seen.
Do you have any reason why James would be leader of the church when Jesus basically anoints Peter?
First, he anoints Peter in Matthew. Matthew is a gospel that's written from Peter's perspective. He doesn't do that in either Mark, Luke, or John. That's a thing that happens. And that's when we're starting. I just realized things. When you read the Bible, and I know most of us don't read the Bible because it's confusing and complicated stuff, but I was reading through Mark recently, and I was thinking about the fact that why is it the family of Jesus and the disciples of Jesus are such idiots? Because they're stupid and they're lazy. Jesus starts praying, they all go to sleep. And so the gospel is written from a perspective of Paul. Mark is written from the perspective of Paul. And who does Paul hate? He hates the family and he hates the apostles. So that person who wrote Mark gathered stories that were very supportive of Paul and very critical of these other people. Matthew, meanwhile, wrote stories that were very supportive of Peter and the Jewish Christians. So he includes all this stuff about the law that none of the other guys mentioned, and he has this story about Peter. It doesn't mean it's true or not true, but that was very important to him. And so he included that stuff. I think that Peter is it's clear he's the number 2 guy. And he is the guy, unlike James, who's going out and trying to convert Jews around the world because the diaspora had happened. And that's why he's the guy who's out in Antioch. It's not James. Peter's out there trying to convert the Jews there. So I think that's the role that he had in the church. He didn't just stay in Jerusalem like James did, but he went out doing this stuff like Paul. Go ahead.
Could you speak to the definition or concept of family then? Family of believers, family by blood. What was belief?
If Jesus actually said, "This is not my family are the people who are going to be with me at the kingdom of God," that was really, really radical stuff. There were things about Jesus that were radical. He didn't get married. That didn't happen in the early church. Jews got married. It's one of the first commandments. You're supposed to get married and have children. And so he didn't do that. The Dead Sea Scrolls didn't either. But rejecting his own family, he lived in a city. Nazareth is a town of 400 people. He's probably related to half the people there, and they end up rejecting him. It's a radical, somewhat sad scenario, but I think Acts sort of helps you recover that. And some of these other things indicate as well. In Acts, his mother comes around and is there with the people of Pentecost. His brothers come around, and there's someone named Salome, and we have no idea who it is, who's at the cross. And I told you the name of the tradition tells us about who's at the cross. What his sisters' names were, and one is Salome. So is it potential that Mary Magdalene, who's a follower, is there, Mary, his mother, is there, and his sister is there? Because that sort of stuff that you did after crucifixion is nasty, nasty stuff. You take a body that's been brutalized, clean it up, put oils on it. Usually it's just family that's going to do that for you. So I think that the fact is, in the Gospels, it's a radical critique of family. But then I think in Acts and the post-Christian stuff, it does come around and to the point that his family are the leaders of the Jerusalem church, almost exclusively from the year 30 to 135. But after that, it ends up disappearing.
So the notion of blood related as a qualifier for family shifts is what I'm hearing.
I think in the end that family ends up mattering. But it is funny when you are reading some of these other stories about the family thinking he's crazy, that you're like, I feel like sometimes that I want to tell family values people, hey, have you read Mark 3? Jesus and his family thought, very highly critical things about what he was doing, especially early on. Some people tried to put all this together and make it all work. And they tried to say they were against him. In John, they were still not with him. In Acts, they came around, and then they became the leaders. It's very comforting to say all of those things. And maybe it did. Maybe that's the story. But I just wanted to let you play detective and put all those parts together and figure out for yourself how it works out. So you can keep the verses, or you can send them to somebody at Christmas, or you can do whatever you want to with those. So I just didn't want to put all the verses up on the screen. So you have one last question.
It seems to me that Jesus was a member of probably a prominent family. Is that right?
First of all, there wasn't, maybe prominent in his own town,
Yeah.
but the people of Galilee were not rich people. There were a few rich people. Mary Magdalene had money. That's why in Luke 8, she's supporting him financially and his disciples. But the rich people were in Jerusalem. These are farmers, sustenance farmers. And Jesus is a day laborer. That's probably the best way to describe what he did. Not a carpenter, he's a day laborer. He goes, and there's a city called Sepphoris that's being built 4 miles away from him. My guess is that's how he made his living. He went up to Sepphoris and helped build the temple that's there, helped build the theater that's there. And if you do go to Israel, you should go to Sepphoris. It's one of the greatest cities around. But I think that's probably what he was doing. He's not sitting there doing fine carpentry work like some people think he was doing. That's not who he was. So I don't think the community he was in was a rich community. I think he was prominent. Everybody knew who he was, and that's why when he came back and started doing miracles, they're like, who the heck is this? We know him. That's his sister right there. There's his brother. So I think everybody knew him in the community. But I don't think they were wealthy. There were very few wealthy Jews at this time. I think you would have to say 90% of the Jews at this time were peasants and people living basically paycheck to paycheck, actually not paycheck to paycheck, from season to season, from harvest to harvest. So what would you think if we just sat down and you guys asked me questions and I try to give you answers on it? Would that be fun or not fun to do?
No, that would be.
Okay, we can try to do that maybe. So the last person I want to do is Mary. And I'll leave you with this. I told you, you be a detective when you try to fit this stuff together. If you have Luke, where he's born of a virgin, Mary's the virgin, she knows who he is, and she expects him to be the Son of God. How do you fit that together with Mark 3, where Mary and his brothers say he's crazy? And in Mark 6, he rejects them and said, Mary and my brothers are not my family. Okay? How do you fit those things together? Did Mary forget everything that happened when the angels came and spoke to her? Or what exactly happened? I'll try to answer that question in the next class. So,
Thank you.
thank you.